what I decided right away was, okay, I'm going to look into this. I never heard any of this kind of stuff before. Sounds pretty unbelievable, but I'm going to look into it.
Okay.
And I kind of divided looking into it onto one track and how to do treatment onto a separate track. This wasn't really about how to do treatment. It was about how much of this is real and what's it all about and what's going on and what can I find out. And that's when I started looking into it, and I filed a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA, started reading books mostly from the late 70s, and then going to the medical school library, and I found out about this whole gigantic mountain of facts and documents. And MKUltra is part of that. It's a CIA mind control program that was declassified in the mid-70s, and it ran from about 1963 to 1972, roughly.
So this is a documented program or operation by the Central Intelligence Agency of the U.S. government.
Yeah, and you can actually, now you can get all the documents on a CD-ROM. Unfortunately, when I got them, it was photocopies at 10 cents a page, 15,000 pages. Now it's like a $30 CD-ROM. But yeah, there's a whole series of these mind control programs that have been declassified since the mid, either 75, 6, 7 in there somewhere.
Right.
And the first program, the CIA was created in 1947.
Right.
The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, was created immediately after Pearl Harbor. It actually was called the Office of Coordination of Information, I think it was, for a little while. Then it was renamed Office of Strategic Services. And it was basically the central intelligence agency of the United States during the Second World War.
Okay, so OSS eventually morphed into CIA.
It was shut down in 1945.
Okay.
And then there's all the sort of bureaucratic gear wheels turning. In 1947, mostly with OSS personnel, it was created as the CIA, or reborn as the CIA.
Right.
And the first declassified CIA mind control program was 1950.
Right.
And that was called Bluebird, which is why my book is called Bluebird.
Ah, because that was the first program.
And it ran about 1950 to 54, 55, and overlapped with Artichoke. And then Bluebird and Artichoke were rolled over into MKUltra, which then ran, I think I said the wrong years before. MKUltra ran 54 to 63, and then MKUltra was rolled over into MK Search, which ran from 1963 to 1972.
So regardless, there's obviously a long history here that we're talking
about. There's a whole
about.
series of programs.
Right.
And you can obtain these documents, anybody can, from the CIA, and some of them are pretty sketchy and some of them are pretty detailed. And there's a whole series of other projects, MK Naomi and MK Delta and Project Dolphin, and there's quite a few different names.
Right, little offshoots and sub-programs and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
Yeah,
that was pretty well all CIA run, but there was a lot of liaison with Army, Navy, and cross-funding with the Air Force.
Amazing. Well, you answered one of my questions. I was going to ask you why you named your book Bluebird.
I actually think I should have stayed with the previous title. A working title I had was The CIA Doctors.
Wow.
And the subtitle was Mind Control Experimentation by Psychiatrists. That would have been a clearer title, actually, but well.
Well, hindsight's 20/20. But I tell you what, regardless of what the cover says on it, it is an incredible book. And I'll tell you, the first time I read it, my initial reaction was at first disgust and rage, quite frankly.
Right.
And I was reasonably familiar with some of the subject matter, but I had never really delved into it at great detail. And that's one of the things that Bluebird gives very clearly, without bias. It just basically goes through the actual documents that you were able to collect through these Freedom of Information searches that you had done.
Every single thing in this book is an absolutely documented fact.
Oh yeah, it's
no rumors, no conspiracy theories, no pet speculations.
Right, and I think that's a good time to clarify that for everybody. The documentation for all of this is in the book, first of all, and it's also available, like Dr. Ross mentioned earlier. You can actually get a CD-ROM with all of these documents declassified now. And for for the sake of getting it out there, my email address is orbitradio, ORBITRADIO, at AOL.com. And if anybody has questions or comments about this, I will get you source information or try to answer your question or do anything I can to further your knowledge about this subject. So, well, anyway, Doctor, what I was saying is that when after I got over the sort of rage of after I read your book, I started thinking about, well, eventually just sort of a desire for justice and accountability and some sort of reconciliation.
Exactly. That's what my main thing is. And so I'm a psychiatrist,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of these mind control experiments were done by psychiatrists, some by psychologists, other physicians, neurosurgeons. So my big focus is on medical ethics. And there's been, you would think that this was impossible. And if I didn't have all these facts, if we went back in time 15 years and somebody else said what I'm just going to say,
right.
I would have blown it off as unbelievable
Mm-hmm.
and impossible. But actually what is factually true is there's been big-scale, systematic, widespread abuse of basic human rights by leading medical school psychiatrists and physicians throughout the second half of the 20th century.
Right, and throughout this country and probably throughout many other countries, too.
Yeah. No doubt, but I have documents only about North America, but I'm sure
right,
it's
right.
universal.
Right, right.
And so you can take this in the direction of anti-government or anti-government's conspiracy theory, and it's not that the government should be off the hook for all these things that have been done, but my personal thing is to really focus on the medical profession and the psychiatrists.
Right. In other words, the CIA may or may not, the intelligence community in general may or may not have had their particular agenda or their look. Their charter is to gather information, and they're going to go about it in any way that they can. They've proven that quite clearly
Right.
Throughout their history. So when I read your book, I certainly saw that in a little bit of a different light then. I understood that you had taken a different tack and basically said, well, look, the CIA did what they did, but they could not have done it without the complicity of the medical community.
Right.
And I mean, Christ, pardon my language, but it just drives me crazy that it's in their own journals. And that
was the other thing I found out when I started to get the documents, and then I started to get the names of some of the investigators and so on, the contractors,
mm-hmm.
and then I started to go to the medical school library because I knew I was mostly looking at the 50s and 60s. I knew the authors to look for.
Right.
I knew some of the places they published, and there's no computerized way to search back then because the computerized indexing of medical journals doesn't go back that far.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to actually go to the library, physically take the 1950 book that's that journal, look through the 12 issues for 1950, put it back on the shelf, look at 1951. So it takes a little bit of time.
Sure.
Which was all just me doing it personally without
Oh,
any
gosh.
funding. But I was able to build up dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of papers published in mainstream medical journals that are in every medical school library in the Western world.
Such as, give me an example of maybe one of these particular journals it may have
American
been.
Journal of Psychiatry, Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, Comprehensive Psychiatry. Most of the main medical journals. The Lancet has material in it. And what you do is you key in on a certain investigator that you know is a CIA contractor, and then he'll have an LSD experiment, and then when you look at the bottom of the first page, it usually says funding sources, and it'll say Office of Naval Research, Department of the Army, Air Force Office of Scientific Research. So there's no question about the funding of it. Then I was just able to basically build up this huge grid of this person was a top-secret cleared CIA contractor at this university at this time on this specific MKUltra project. He also had Air Force money when he was at this university doing this experiment that he published in this journal. And the second and third authors were these two guys, and these two guys published with this other guy who was also a CIA contractor who published with this guy, and it just turned into this huge web
Mm-hmm.
of relationships and connections involving Yale, Harvard, UCLA, Tulane,
Stanford, for sure.
Stanford. So it's not just some mad scientist in a basement somewhere a long time ago.
Right.
It's very organized. It's the main medical schools and a lot of the major figures in psychiatry. For instance, when I was even in medical school, but in psychiatry, I heard about Carl Rogers,
Mm-hmm.
who was a psychologist who's identified with this kind of therapy called client-centered therapy. And the kind of stereotype of that is with the client's in there for a therapy session and says, "I'm really mad at my mom." And the therapist says, "I hear you saying that you're really mad at your mom."
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of touchy-feely, and you're supposed to, number one, value the client, and it's all centered on the best interest of the client. It's also called humanistic therapy.
Right.
So it's like Mr. Nice Guy therapy. Well, lo and behold, Carl Rogers was cleared at top secret. He was a CIA contractor himself, ran experiments for the CIA on subjects, which he published in psychology journals, and he was on the board of a CIA front organization that funneled money from the CIA inside the MKUltra program to the front organization, which then gave grants to academics who didn't realize it was CIA money.
Incredible.
And so a lot of these major figures were directly involved.
You know, and that's the, when I said I was disgusted earlier, my disgust didn't only come from the fact that these things were actually carried out, you know, but it was just as much for the way in which they were carried out, like you're talking about now, covertly, oftentimes without informed consent of the subject or victim or whatever you want to call them.
A lot of apologists will always say, "Oh, well, that was a long time ago. We didn't have the same ethical standards now.
Huh.
We have different kinds of committees now."
Right.
They're completely bogus.
It is.
These experiments violated everything going all the way back to the Hippocratic Oath,
Sure.
the Nuremberg Code, Helsinki Codes, every ethical code that's been in the last 2,000 plus years. Specifically, these were crimes against humanity that would have got a lot of press if they were done by Nazi doctors during the Second World War.
SS eventually morphed into CIA.
It was shut down in 1945.
Okay.
And then there's all the sort of bureaucratic gear wheels turning. In 1947, mostly with OSS personnel, it was created as the CIA, or reborn as the CIA.
Right.
And the first declassified CIA mind control program was 1950.
Right.
And that was called Bluebird, which is what I decided right away was, okay, I'm going to look into this. I never heard any of this kind of stuff before. Sounds pretty unbelievable, but I'm going to look into it.
Okay.
And I kind of divided looking into it onto one track and how to do treatment onto a separate track. This wasn't really about how to do treatment. It was about how much of this is real and what's it all about and what's going on and what can I find out. And that's when I started looking into it, and I filed
a program or operation by the Central Intelligence Agency of the U.S. government.
Yeah, and you can actually now you can get all the documents on a CD-ROM. Unfortunately, when I got them, it was photocopies at 10 cents a page, 15,000 pages. Now it's like a $30 CD-ROM. But there's a whole series of these mind control programs that have been declassified since the mid, there's 75, 6, 7 in there somewhere.
Right.
And the first program, the CIA was created in 1947.
Right.
The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, was created immediately after Pearl Harbor. It actually was called the Office of Coordination of Information, I think it was, for a little while. Then it was renamed Office of Strategic Services. And it was basically the central intelligence agency of the United States during the Second World War.
Okay, so
A bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests for the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Started reading books mostly from the late 70s. Then going to the medical school library, and I found out about this whole gigantic mountain of facts and documents. And MKUltra is part of that. It's a CIA mind control program that was declassified in the mid-70s, and it ran from about 1963 to 1972, roughly.
So this is a documented